Welcome, everyone. As you're joining, just continue to introduce yourself. Let us know.
From Greece, Los Angeles, Toronto, Portland. Someone else from India, hello.
Oh wow, from Manila and Mexico. So cool.
Midnight in Singapore, hello. Thanks for staying up. We see you. Colombia. Chile, Santa Barbara, Australia.
Georgia, not the US Georgia, the other Georgia.
So cool.
Good morning, Vancouver. Let's see that.
Hi, Louisiana.
Midnight in Manila. I like how
I like that.
Sounds like a movie.
Super exciting. Welcome, welcome. So continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to Office Hours. So this is hosted in conjunction with MoMA's free online courses about teaching with art, and that's art and inquiry, art and activity, and art and ideas. If you're not enrolled in one of MoMA's online courses yet, we hope that you will join us and enroll after this session. So my colleague is going to be pasting a link in a few minutes into the chat. And so I'm really excited. I'm Lisa Mazzola. I'm the Assistant Director of School and Teacher Programs at MoMA, and I'm also the course instructor for the 3 courses. And I'm joined by my colleagues in MoMA School and Teacher Programs and also Access Programs.
Yeah, so I'm glad to join. My name is Francis Estrada. I'm the Assistant Educator for School and Teacher Programs here at MoMA.
Hi, I'm Larissa Raphael. I am the Associate Educator, also in School and Teacher Programs at MoMA.
And I'm Carrie McGee. I work in community and access programs, working with visitors with disabilities at MoMA.
And we are also very excited to be joined by our colleague from the New York City Department of Education, Amanda McFee.
Hi everyone, I'm Amanda McFee from New York City Department of Education. I work for District 75. It's a district in the city that I'll tell you a little bit more about later, as the Coordinator of Arts Education.
So Office Hours is meant to be an informal hour-long conversation to extend the conversations that you've all been having in the discussion forums. And today we're really excited to focus on this very important topic, which is about adapting the teaching methodologies we explore in all 3 courses when we're working with students with intellectual, developmental, and physical disabilities. So thank you to those of you who've already started to have conversations in the discussion forums. It's been great for us to read that. We're going to be starting today with opening comments from Carrie and Amanda, and then we're going to field questions about accessibility from the discussion forums and answering the questions that you're going to submit live with us right now. And though we plan to stay focused on the topic, we'll also be happy to answer any questions related to the course and museum teaching strategies if we have time. So throughout the session, please make sure to post your questions for us in the chat. Just to let you know, we are using Rev to create, it's an online system to create closed captioning subtitles during this session. We are actually trying Rev for the first time, so please bear with us in case there are any technical difficulties. Just so you guys know, you can access the captions by navigating to the bottom right of the Zoom window on desktop, and you can click on either closed captions and then view subtitles, or you can click the 3 dots for more and then click on view subtitles. My colleague will also be putting this information in the chat. And speaking of that, several of our MoMA colleagues are actually present behind the scenes. And they may also respond to you in the chat. So feel free to use the chat to talk with other attendees, and know that any questions that you have will be addressed by our other colleagues as well. We are recording this session, and we will share it with you in the coming days, the link to the session in the coming days. With that, we are going to kick off our conversation with Carrie and Amanda. And we brought them both together because we wanted to give you all the perspective from both the museum education side, but also someone working directly in the schools. So with that, so Carrie and Amanda, tell us a little bit more about your work and about your approach.
Sure, I'll start. Hi, I'm Carrie again from MoMA's Access Programs. And the reason I really wanted to ask, and thought it was important to ask Amanda to join us in this session is because I'm not a certified classroom teacher, nor do I have a degree in special education. My experience is as an educator and an administrator at MoMA. And I have been at MoMA for 17 years, and I focus on work with audiences with disabilities. So sometimes that's students with disabilities through the New York City Department of Education, where Amanda works. Other times that's adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities, individuals with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, individuals with mental illness, individuals who are blind or have low vision, individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. So really thinking about not day-to-day teaching in a classroom, but how do we make sure that those individuals are able to have equality of participation within the museum. And the way I really approach this work, and we approach it at MoMA, is to really think about the social model of disability. And if you're not familiar with the social model of disability, I feel like that's one of the most important things I can share with you today. And I'll ask my colleagues to drop in the chat a link to a great video that explains the concept. But essentially there are a couple models of disability. And there's an old, outdated model that many of us were taught as we were growing up, which is kind of the medical model that says, it really regards disability in a negative way and says, there's something wrong with you and it's your problem, your responsibility to fix it. And the social model of disability flips that and says, disability is a neutral difference between people and acknowledges that people with disabilities are just like everybody else, and that what actually disables people are barriers in society. Physical barriers like stairs, where there's no ramp or elevator, environmental barriers, and also attitudinal barriers. Often people with disabilities talk about attitudes toward them being one of the largest barriers they face in society. So I think a lot of the work that you're doing is not about a specific technique that you shift and do differently, but really coming to understand the social model of disability and really viewing and interacting with students with disabilities from that standpoint.
So I'll go ahead and jump in. So again, my name's Amanda. I am here from New York City Department of Education as the arts coordinator of District 75. So there's a lot of you that may have never heard about District 75 before. And so what that is it's a specialized educational district in all 5 boroughs of New York. And they work with specialized education programs, vocational programs, and behavioral support programs for students who may have autism spectrum disorder, multimodal disabilities, moderate to severe cognitive delays, emotional disturbances, sensory impairments, multiple disabilities, deaf or hard of hearing services, and visual impairments. And so my role there is basically providing professional development for teachers to learn how to support students with special needs, creating partnerships with the community. Like I'm blessed to be able to work with the MoMA. We have so many overlaps in that aspect, creating partnerships and supporting family engagement across the city. And so one of those things that I truly believe in, studying art and also studying severe multimodal disabilities and studying education, that in the arts, it actually gives people an open playing field and actually, levels that so that students have an opportunity to work with their age level peers. It builds communication and socialization. It develops motoric skills. It increases independence and problem solving. And it's innate in the actual construct of the discipline, which is so exciting because as echoing what Carrie was saying, that social model of understanding needs is that everybody has needs, and it's just looking at how we can support students individually and not specifically targeting someone because they're labeled in such a way. So, when we think about those mindset shifts and we think about understanding that social model in terms of, again, everybody has needs. We all have needs. Like, I have a lot of needs. So how do we support every individual as an individual in that environment? And so that sounds like a daunting task to say, oh my God, I have 177 kids. How do I even begin to individualize instruction for everyone? But if you think of it in the terms of like a universal design mindset, that one point of access isn't necessarily for one, but it helps the community. As Carrie was talking about curb cuts, that was put in place for somebody that may be non-ambulatory. And that curb cuts now helps people with grocery carts, and it helps moms with strollers. And so thinking about how these minor tweaks to our environment or to our instruction actually support the community as a whole. And it's a really positive way to looking about supporting kids. So there you go.
You're on mute, Lisa.
Sorry about that. So Carrie, do you want to start with the question that was sent to you privately in the chat? And please do, when you submit your questions, make sure to submit them to everyone, not to just linking on to the speakers. That way other people can see the questions as well.
Yes, thank you, because I just happened to look at the chat, but now I've closed it, so I'm not distracted. So please send your questions to everyone. But Tucker asked about art projects for students with low vision, and I'll give you a couple ideas. Then when Amanda talks, I'll also try and drop some other resources in the chat. But we have a longstanding partnership with Education Vision Services in New York City. So that's students who are blind or have low vision throughout the city. And one of the things when we start working with them every year, one year when I was teaching a 5th grade class, I asked them, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? So that's another thing that you can ask your students. I always say to the educators I work with, the way you start isn't like, what's the best project I could do for students who are blind? Or what's the best project I could do for students who have autism? It's like, what's the best project I could do? And then think through the steps of how you're going to remove any barriers for a specific student. So when I started the partnership one year with the students, I said to them, what kinds of things, what kinds of art making would you like to do this year? And they said, anything but clay, because everybody just gives us clay. Because if you just are thinking, okay, what can blind students do? Then you're going to think about something that's tactile in 3D. They said, we want to do painting. And I thought there were a couple of students had a little bit of vision and the rest had no residual vision. And I thought, okay, how are we going to do painting? But they really wanted to do painting. So I then figured out a kind of 3-step process. And I'm going to give this as an example because it will show how you can really do anything. So there's something called a raised line drawing board. I'll try and send a link to what I'm talking about. It's a rubberized surface. And then you put like a clear sheet of kind of like a plasticky about on top of it. And then when you draw with a pen, whatever you're drawing, it raises the line. So then a student can feel that line and see what they, see by feeling what they've made. So we created a project where we were inventing imaginary animals based on some works in MoMA's collection. And the students started by drawing on those raised line drawing boards. And then we had them translate those 2-dimensional drawings into 3D sculptures. and we used wood, you can use wood, you could use clay, different things. So there still was some sculptural 3D element. And then we did painting where we added paint to those. And for the students who had no residual vision, when we did the painting, we assigned them an assistant. So like I might be the assistant to someone, and we talked just about how contemporary artists often use assistants and don't always do all of their own painting. So I would have the student describe to me the color that they wanted to use, and then I would get that color, mix that color, give it to them, and then they would do it. And we were just using, describing what we were doing to make that accessible to them. So I would say that you can do anything with your students, and it's really thinking through how are you going to adapt the different processes and what tools like the raised line drawing boards could you do to make it accessible, but not limit yourself to thinking that students with low vision or any other particular disability can only do certain things. And Amanda, I wonder if you have any other examples or resources thinking about that audience.
About visual impairments, you mean? Sorry. Yeah, so I actually was just dropping some resources in on a page so that can actually be added in, because there was another conversation in the chat based on resources, and the Kennedy Center actually has an exuberant amount of resources that you can go through and access, that they have different books and different levels kind of targeting different types of needs that people have. So that would also be a great center of resources to look at.
Great. So take a Perga's question, and I'm going to turn this to you, Carrie, and she's asking about MoMA and do we support the development, curriculum development, and visual art development for schools. And I'm assuming she means in relation to this audience and this work. So yeah, I'll send that one to you.
Yeah, so we do in a couple ways. So one, we do offer, right now it's kind of on hold, but we do offer during the year in-person workshops for teachers who are local to think about our process of both art making, but also looking at art. So if you've done the Coursera courses that feature Lisa and others, you know that a lot of MoMA's strategies of engagement are also about looking at and having discussion around works of art. So we do offer professional development for teachers working with students with disabilities throughout the year. Maybe there's a chance this year, as a lot of our work will be remote, that maybe we will do some online versions that would be open to all of you around the world and not just local teachers. But I would also underscore that it's not, if you've watched Lisa's courses, it's not that different. We don't have a total different way of working. We don't do a total different set of activities, but it's really about understanding different disabilities and understanding communication strategies of students with different disabilities so that we can make sure that all of the activities and ways we engage are accessible. One example of that is thinking about working with students who are less verbal or nonverbal, and not just excluding them from the conversation, but really getting comfortable. Like that student already lives in that reality all the time. So often people say, oh, I don't want to make them uncomfortable, but really it's about our own discomforts. So saying, okay, well, instead I'm going to use body language, I'm going to use facial expression, I'm going to be really ready to switch to yes or no questions. You can actually have a very complex conversation with either or yes or no questions if you've planned it in advance and have scaffolded your questions so you can build up, thinking about giving choices between materials so that not everyone just has to get up from their desk and go grab all the materials and just work independently with little instruction. You might want to think about breaking down activities into different steps, not just talking through a demonstration, but actually giving the students some of the materials. And we kind of talk about doing icebreakers with materials where you have some sort of warm-up activity that demonstrates how to use the materials. So if I'm going to do a collage project, I might have a quick activity that we all do together that kind of feels like a fun game, moving around and dropping different pieces of paper. But what that game is also doing is it's demonstrating for all different kinds of learners what we're going to be doing with these materials later. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I would say keep checking out all of the MoMA Learning and Coursera courses. And stay tuned, follow us on MoMA Learning Twitter, and if we do any virtual professional development, then you'll find it there.
Great. So next, let's start off with a question for Amanda and then Carrie from Francisco. And he's asking, are there any tips on accessing students with mental health conditions? I recently found myself teaching a group that included a student with severe depression, anxiety, ADD, and hyperactivity, and I didn't really know how to assess him in relation to his classmates. So Amanda, do you want to start us off there?
So when art can be, one of the greatest things about the arts is that it can be very intrinsically motivating for students. And when you're working with a student that has ADHD or some sort of emotional need that we're working with, you can consider looking at high interest area of the arts and find out what their targeted focus will be on that task. Because when you're working with those students, sometimes the thing that you're working on is attention to task and how long they can attain. So what that would basically mean is how long they can actually focus on said activity. So to increase that with a student, and then you can actually build in other academics around that, is actually looking at those high interest areas. So you could actually start out by, if for instance that you're working with visual arts, like start with something that's extremely tactile, because a lot of things that happen with students with those types of needs is that they have a very high level of anxiety. And so what you want to do is you want to try to reduce the anxiety in the environment. And as you're reducing the anxiety in the environment, you're going to be able to see more of that creative side and that interest, and then their art is going to start telling that story. So, simply starting with clay to work on some sort of sculpture. Your job isn't necessarily to get to the root of, if it is like a depression set type of anxiety, like another type of therapist, like you could joint actively work with them in those types of therapies and things like that. But reducing anxiety and attention to task would be the keys to working with those students, because as soon as you create a calm and welcoming environment for that child, they're going to feel more comfortable in that mode of whatever type of art that you're doing. I hope that answers the question. Per se.
Yeah. And I would add, I think just not seeing that student is totally different than all of the other students, and that often the way, because of the anxiety and depression, the way that you interact and relate to that student will make all the difference. So if you can relate in a way that says, I see you, I'm comfortable with you, I'm not freaked out, I don't know what to do, and you can just really talk to that student as, kind of human to human, not as a therapist. One of the things we're really clear about is, like, we are not art therapists, we are not practicing art therapy. It is not our job to get to, the root or to provide any therapy, but we have found often that students, that art can be a place, and the museum or the art studio classroom can be a place where students of all different kinds of experiences or with all different sorts of disabilities can really be themselves and express themselves. So I think, like Amanda said, also trying to find something the student's really interested in and starting there. I also think that one of the ways you can start, and someone else had asked a question ahead of times in one of the chat about, like, what are good ways to get started? What are good, if I have a group that I'm interested in doing something with, how do I get started? And I think starting with things that are like really low barrier to success. So not starting with something like, oh, I'm going to draw this still life of these flowers, something where people will feel like they need to get it perfectly, but starting with something with any audience that is abstract, doing collage with colored papers, doing, kind of big abstract watercolor designs where it's not about something about getting it right. So then you can also be, there's kind of low anxiety, low barrier to success. Or if someone has a mobility impairment, or, you're not sure exactly how they communicate during that process, you can start to get to know them and see how they work, and then think about how things will progress. So I would say find out what they're interested in and start with something that is easy. And, drawing is often not that thing for people at the beginning, and then they can work up to something.
Yeah, and just echoing a little bit more off of what Carrie was saying, is that the importance of, and getting started and even working with students with any type of need, like a lot of the underlining reactionary, behavioral circumstances that happened with students is really based on their level of anxiety and them not being able to self-regulate yet. So all of that self-regulation is a learned behavior that as children we had the opportunity to go through that, and for the length of time, that's something that we have to explicitly teach for certain students. So to find those high interest areas to work on those other skills, you can have exploratory play, which is very low risk for everyone in the class, and you can start it at the beginning of any unit. Where Carrie talked about collage, or I mentioned sculpture, those are things that are very low risk, where it's like, let's put a bunch of clay on the table and let's just feel it. Let's, talk about it. What does it remind you of? Make a little type, just an abstract type of mold, or just squeeze it in your hands, or even just tear up pieces of paper and put it different places on your desk. Like, that exploratory portion of art is so important to understand the medium that you're presenting to the students. And oftentimes we forget that, and we go straight into the craft of, this is the itemized description of how you have to build a balanced sculpture or create a balanced collage, and all of those things that we forget that we had a bunch of time to play with. The students that may have never had the opportunity at their home to experience some of the tools that we're working with, or experience some of the mediums that we're working with. So that in itself actually will then reduce a lot of the anxiety than having multiple entries to unknown territory in your classroom. So it's really important just to kind of think about in segments of exploration, learning craft, and then going to creative is a great way that we talk about how to kind of lengthen out your unit of study, or not even necessarily a unit of study, but a lesson, to make sure that if it's something new that the student is being exposed to, that you take the time to work on that, and it actually brings out a lot of other things for the student.
That's great. Carrie, did you want to address Darajan's question about some of the experts and colleagues that you bring in when you're planning resources and programs?
Sure. Darajan had a question about, do we engage with experts and psychologists and different experts when we're developing programs? And yes, and I'll explain how, but I don't want you to think that you have to do that to be able to work with people with disabilities, because you don't. Our strategy is that we work with our educators and all of our, team to be kind of the best arts educators we can be. And we work through inquiry-based education. So when we're looking at and discussing works, we're working through inquiry. We're, not lecturing and telling people, we're working through looking and asking questions, as you have seen in many of Lisa's Coursera courses. And then when we're making, we're really thinking about doing the best studio projects we can. So it's not that we need anything approved by a psychologist if we're working with people with mental health difficulties, or an expert with working with people with any sort of disability, but rather we try and make sure that we are fully knowledgeable about different disabilities and communication strategies and ways to adapt communication or adapt art making tools. So those are the ways in which we engage with experts. And sometimes that is in person. So when we started a program for people with dementia, we learned a lot from people who train family members of people with dementia in communication strategies. So it's not that they design our program, but they just help us learn more on the communication end. But sometimes it's also just doing the same thing you would do, doing some internet research about what's the best way to make this adaptive paintbrush. Also, sometimes it's just trying and making our own adaptive tools. So we try and be really knowledgeable about communication strategies and the big communication barriers and attitudinal barriers faced by different audiences. And then we're doing the same thing we would do with any other audience. So sometimes we do engage with experts, but not in that they don't design our program. Just like when another group of kids without disabilities goes to a museum, no one's thinking of it as a therapeutic intervention, and that's the same for us. Also, I want to just say Emma in the UK asked about working in the UK prison with learners who have little experience with traditional idea of museums or galleries, also no contact with the internet and restricted materials, any ideas or resources to support. And I would say the things I was talking about earlier was starting with things that have a low barrier to success. But I would also say that you can make very simple materials be useful for you in doing a really elevated project, and it's just how you talk about it. So I think it's really important to talk to adults on an adult level. I also think it's good, not to talk down to children. So I could say I was only allowed, and I actually used to work teaching art in a juvenile detention center. So say you're only allowed to use paper and crayons or something like that, and you think, oh, these are adults and this feels so childish. But if you brought in some examples to show them of artists who work in an abstract way, just focusing on color, and you kind of set it and frame it with kind of an adult framing, and then you say, let's try, these are these things that kids use, but let's try and use them and see if we can play with color and emotion in a different way, things like that. So I think a lot of it is about whatever resources you're allowed to use, supplies you're allowed to use, whatever you have available to you, you can kind of make that work by framing it in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Carrie, can we actually, just to build on what you were just saying, could we also address Lee's question? Lee was asking about, for those of us that are teaching in museums, how we can engage without seeming, his question was, how best can we engage without seeming like we're being a disciplinarian?
Yes, and I think Lee was talking about specifically also sometimes in working with students with autism or different things. So I think, again, it's all about the tone we take. So we think one of the best strategies museum educators can use is making a great first impression and trying to, dismantle the idea that like, oh, I'm the teacher, I'm the museum educator, and I'm in charge, and you're this. So for instance, when students walk through the door, even if they're students on the autism spectrum, if they're not, I walk up and I introduce myself. I say, hi, I'm Carrie. I shake hands. And all of these things, when all of a sudden, a lot of times kids in general, but especially kids with disabilities, are not used to being treated really well and with a lot of respect. And so starting out by doing that, all of a sudden you'll see kids stand a little different. They start to, respond. And so I also will explain the rules in a very direct way and let them also know, though, that these are rules for everyone, that these are rules for adults and rules for them. And I would say all of the things that sometimes people are afraid of, what's going to happen if you have, this person in the museum, those aren't the things that we see happening. We find that people kind of rise to the occasion of our high expectations of them and the belief we have that this is a place for you and you're welcome here. But we do try and be very literal, and just, especially if we're working with people on the autism spectrum, and letting them know beforehand, if possible, what to expect when you arrive at the museum, so that it doesn't feel like all of a sudden you're disciplining them on the spot. Or also, if you do have to remind someone, just framing it that as a reminder and explaining the why can be really helpful. So not saying, stop doing that, stop touching this, but to say, we have to keep, our hands away from the works of art so that we don't accidentally damage them. Then that makes things a little easier. So I really think it's about tone, and museums can be seen as a very, a place where you're not allowed to do this, not. So we try, I also say when I'm giving the rules of the museum to a group of students, I always say the last rule is to have fun, try and end up on a positive, but really creating that environment of positive emotion, I think goes really far, especially if the museum space is new to them.
Absolutely. And so much of what you're saying, it's so true, Carrie. It's so true what we do in obviously in school and teacher programs broadly as well. So it's just great to hear that once again from you. Amanda, I wanted to field a question to you from Maria, who submitted this via the discussion forums. She wanted to know about the MIME tools as a means of teaching with disabilities.
Sure. So one of the things that, thank you so much for sending in your question early, so one of the things about MIME that you can use is it's basically in terms of when you think about response for students, it's a great way to use that as a way to have them kinesthetically respond. And you can do that through theatrical play, or you can actually do that in critique or observation of a visual arts piece, where you can, if you're working with students, and this especially works well with students who may be nonverbal or use picture exchange communication, that they can, if they have the ability to physically use their body, they can act out the response that they're thinking. So you can give a prompt in an acting class or in any class really, or you can have them say you're looking at a painting from Matisse and it's like the olive trees, and you're like, okay, well, what is the main piece that you're looking at? And the students can, move their hands in the air to actually look, in fact, like a tree, or, what kind of tree would you be? Are you a happy tree? Are you a sad tree? And that you can use it in that. One of the things that also came to mind when you were talking about MIME is that there are actually some other theatrical strategies that you can use that are really great for teaching social emotional understanding and really going into depth for identifying emotions, which is talking about mirroring, where a student, you're acting out said emotion physically and, with your facial expression and your body, and then the student is mimicking that. And if you are working with students that are early learners, and when I say early learners, I don't necessarily mean chronologically, but cognitively, that they may be working on those pre-academic skills or pre-early learner language skills, where mimicking is such a huge part of social communication. When you think about having those beginning stages, like having that physical response through MIME or through mirroring or through Tableau, which is really big now, but it's very similar to MIME, is something that can really bring out another side of a student, because sometimes, unless you prepare the pictures and teach them the vocabulary that those pictures are related to, students may not always be able to express themselves in entirety. So having that option of a physical response to something is a huge opportunity. And then Lisa, can I go back to add something to Lee's question?
Sure.
Is that okay? Sorry, I was like typing and I was like, oh wait, I can add to that. Because one of the things I'm especially working with students that may have autism spectrum disorder, there's like, while our district is so blessed to work with the MoMA, we actually work with a few other museums in the city as well. And one of the things that we've worked on with teaching artists and museum educators is that, thinking about having a pre-conversation with the teacher to find out, what are the communicative and sensory needs of the group that's coming to the museum. One of the things that they are phenomenal with at the MoMA is that when the students walk in, the museum educator is greeting every single student and making them feel empowered and respected. And in just that tiny, little piece of, hey, how are you? I'm Carrie, and it's great to meet you. We're so glad you came to the museum today. Or, hi, I'm Lisa. We're so honored for you to come and see what we have and, the activity that we're doing. The kids feel like that feeling of respect and that we're mutual equals and having this amazing opportunity to go to an area that's outside of the building, working in special education for many, many years, that is something that the students 100% rise to the occasion when they feel that mutual respect. And one of the things that teaching artists and museum educators can also do is, if there's a need that the students have some sort of sensory need, like carrying a bag with you, that if we're going to talk about a piece of art that has, different shapes or different types of objects or, different textures, like, is there a bag of materials that you can bring with you, that if they have that need to have a tactile experience with that art piece, that if you're talking about a work of art that looks painterly, have gobs of paint on a piece of canvas that they can just feel it right there in the gallery. And then you can teach them. And then it becomes a learning opportunity to say, we can't touch the art because it's very precious and we have to keep it special. And, like, think of your very special toy and, and then talk about like how, these are ways to address your own sensory needs. And then it teaches them self-regulation outside of a school environment. And the learning skills of that kid is then generalized. So you're having this full circle of generalization in the classroom and in the museum. So you see so much more gains in independence with self-regulation. So it's amazing to have that connection with the museum educator and that pre-conversation, because the skills that teachers work on for the entire year, like all of them can be addressed in an hour-long trip to the museum, when it becomes greeting a new person, when it becomes having a conversation with a peer, when it becomes self-regulation and knowing appropriate behavior. It's really, truly an amazing opportunity for kids. So if you can start at your organization and start having those conversations, it would be a really, really amazing way to, you know, start something new at where it is that you are. Sorry, I digress on my soapbox, but it is phenomenal.
No, that's great, Amanda. Thank you so much. I think that's great. And before I move on to the next question from Gabby, someone did come up, I think it was Julie, had a follow-up question just about examples of mimicking emotion. So I don't know if, Amanda, you wanted to touch on that.
Sure. So one example, and I have a teaching packet I can send. It's like 100 pages, but one of the things that you can actually do is, if you're teaching a new emotion and you're like, I am really sad, and you're like, and show them like physically what your body positioning looks like. I'm slunched down, my eyes are rolled, you know, my lip may come out, or I'm really happy, and you're like, your body's elevated and you have a smile on your face, that they're actually having that connection. And then, you know, mimicking is basically modeling. So when you have that modeling, or in the social communicative world, it's called imitation. So like when a student is imitating your behavior, that's what they're talking. So imitation or mimic is the same as like a mirrored activity. So just as the student would be your mirror. So whatever action you have on your face and your body, the student would then relay that. I hope that answers the question.
I would say in a museum, a simple way I would explain that, like I'll use a drawing that my daughter made. If I say, you know, look at the painting and tell me what you see, then I would look at the painting. So I'm also showing them what I want to do, I'm demonstrating with my own body and my own facial expression. And several people have asked questions related to literature, books, resources, and I will say that one, Amanda, there will be a follow-up email you'll get if you're subscribed to any of these Coursera courses in the next few days, and Amanda is putting together a treasure trove of resources for you there. I don't know that there is a particular book, especially because, like we said, in terms of museums, it's not a totally different way. You could just research kind of inquiry-based museum education. You can look on our MoMA website. We have a museum training resources page, which has a lot of information about working with audiences with disabilities. And I also just am going to have my colleagues drop in the chat the Museum Arts and Culture Access Consortium, which is a New York City-based consortium of people who work in different museums around disability, equality, and all of the professional development they do, they record and they share on their website. So that if you're really interested in access to museums, you should really look at this macaccess.org webpage. And you can also see a lot of at-home things that museums are offering that people can do at home during COVID. So that would be the #1 resource I would recommend pertaining to museums.
So Gabby had a question about activities in museums and recommended structures. And actually, I think, Larissa, you're going to answer this one.
Larissa's going to answer, tying, I think, the connection between art and literature. And for the recommended structure, I'll just tell you really quickly the 2 different structures we use, which are the exact same structures that our colleagues in school programs use. Again, it's not that different. If we're just going into the galleries and just doing looking, we take an hour. Sometimes we could easily take longer, but we usually take an hour, and we'll look at 3 to 4 works of art in that hour, all centered around a theme, the same things you're seeing in Lisa's courses. If we're doing art looking and then art making, we'll often take 2 hours, and we'll do an hour in the galleries looking at art, and then an hour in a studio classroom making art. And sometimes people think like, oh, my students could never have that stamina. I've even had parents of kids with intellectual or developmental disabilities say, my kid's never going to make it through the whole thing, so don't be offended if we leave early. And they always stay the full 2 hours. So again, I think the dynamic you set up and the environment you set up and the way you engage students, they can, often we're kicking people out at the end of the time. So an hour to 2 hours is usually how we frame it.
Great. So now, thank you. Let's move on to someone who's T period. Have you had experience with tying up art with literature? I would like to hear your thoughts more about this. And yes, our colleague Larissa is going to speak to this.
Yes, thank you for that question. It is something that we're very interested in, and it's a question that we get often from teachers when they're booking school programs. Very often they come from English language arts classes, literature classes, and there's so many natural connections between using visual arts and teaching literature. One is, I'd say, primarily is the focus on close looking and reading and noticing details and making inferences. I think that's the primary that's a skill that you need both to look at art and to read a work of literature, or any work of text, I should say, not just works of literature, any text. And also art teaches point of view. And I think that's not just the point of view of the author or the artist, which is important to understand, but also understanding the point of view of the different people, the point of view that different people bring when they're looking at art. Also, both require analysis and interpretation and separating out observations versus interpretation, vocabulary building. I think Amanda and Carrie have both mentioned vocabulary building, like art as a great tool for vocabulary building. I think it's both are great tools for conveying complex ideas. Also great for inspiring real or imagined narratives. And also a lot of artworks in the museum incorporate text. So those are just the kind of the broad connections. One of our most popular requests for younger students is a characters themed tour. And it really, just to get a little bit more specific, it really helps teachers come to it wanting their students to understand the similarities between how an artist might portray a character in a work of art versus how a writer might build a character in a written work. And that includes professional writers, but also students themselves as writers, and thinking about kind of those specific details that they want to notice, gestures, emotions, and all those clothing, settings, expressions, all those things that are part of building a rounded out character. And it's also, art can be a great jumping off point for writing, for students writing. This could be narrative works of art, or it could be poetry. It could be group poetry, where you just have students throw out words and combine them into a poem, or it could be something more advanced and more extended. So there's just a lot of ways that we use art to connect to literature, and we work always closely with the teachers to know what the students already know. And I don't know, I thought I saw Amanda, I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well, if you want to.
Yeah, and just one of the major things is talking about what Larissa said in terms of, academic content. Arts integration is a really incredible way to have students have like a greater understanding of the historical ties between arts and literature. Poetry and literature has gone together hand in hand, and a lot of great pieces of art and history were actually inspired by great pieces of literature, and vice versa. So there could be an interesting conversation to start off, a unit of study about those, and how one is inspired by the other, and how great masters had a lot of historical ties with the rationale of creating this piece of literature at a particular time in history, and the same existed for this painting, and also the same existed for mathematics and, you know, for scientific discovery at the time. So if you start looking at like cross-curricular counterpoints, there's like incredible pieces that tie in social studies, that talk in chemical compounds and geographic trade at the time, that you can really have an all-encompassing understanding of major key periods of time just based on a single piece of artwork.
That's great. Carrie, did you want to just speak a little bit about the resources, and then we can also drop those in the chat that you were mentioning?
I forgot when telling you things to read or check out. I also think that anyone working with people with disabilities, I think there are 2 films that are really, both documentaries that are really essential watching, and we'll drop them in the chat. One is called Wretches and Jabberers, and it is a documentary about 2 adults, one who is an artist living with autism, who were not able to speak, and then learn to both speak and type to communicate. And it really gives you, it fundamentally changed the way that I think about autism, and I really highly recommend it. And the other is called Crip Camp, which just came out on Netflix this year, which is really about the revolution working towards disability equality. We're about to have the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act here, and that is really about this camp that was in upstate New York and the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where individuals with disabilities would come, and they really became the leaders in the disability equality movement. So I think that, you know, sometimes everyone's looking for like a very practical thing to do, but I think sometimes studying up in this way will actually lead to great things for you. So check those out.
If you have not seen Crip Camp, I cannot recommend this film enough. It's a truly, truly amazing film. So next we have a question from Virginia, and maybe Amanda, you can start off, and then Carrie, you can answer as well. And her question says, what about PTSD? What about Open Studio? I'm not entirely sure what that means, but Virginia, if you want to clarify more about that, you can do that in the chat. And she's asking, I think, about our methods, and is it the best curable process? So Amanda, we were talking a little bit before about differences, you know, prior to today between art therapy, and maybe you can address some of this.
Yeah, so one of the things that, you know, Carrie and I mentioned at the beginning is, you know, we're not necessarily art therapists or counselors and things like that. So that's one thing that we want to remember, that as art educators and museum educators, like our responsibility is having like a skilled understanding of an arts discipline and relaying that discipline. And while you can use that to build an understanding and have that to bridge an understanding of social emotional learning in terms of self-expression and self-regulation, you know, art therapy really ties in that therapeutic relationship that people have one-on-one with a counselor, and people bring the arts into counseling as a way to, you know, reduce anxiety and those other things that we're talking about. But there does become like a very distinctive divide in our responsibilities as educators or museum educators. And that's the one thing that, you know, we don't want to like overstep, because these people, you know, people could be in intensive therapies for that, and that we don't want us to, you know, derail any of their therapeutic interventions that they have. However, you know, some teachers have, like in our district, you know, we're all trained with therapeutic crisis intervention. And a lot of times art, like we talked about before, is actually very intrinsically motivating in terms of helping a student to focus on another area. So if you would work collaboratively with, say, a school counselor, if you're an educator and students are suffering from emotional disturbances or PTSD from some sort, you know, as some sort of diagnosis, you can tie in and understand that they may have a level of anxiety that's heightened by certain content topics that are being discussed in class, or just in general from transitioning to one environment to the next. You know, some tricks of the trade that you can do is just prepare a child to transition between activities or between rooms. You know, if you're in a museum, making a statement, and now we're finished in this room and we will be going to the next room to discuss this, that there is a pause and preparation for somebody who has a need to understand the structure of the day or the structure of the trip. And the same thing exists as an educator in the classroom and preparing for transitions in the environment, where it's from task to task or location to location or single activity to group activity and whatever you're doing. But a lot of the things that we had talked about earlier in the call is that, you know, there are ways to use art to, you know, you could think about using it as a center. You could think about using it where a student is able to decide the direction of their own project and have something that's self-driven. But, you know, there's a lot of research that I actually dropped from artandhealing.org that talks about art and PTSD, if that's something that you're interested in reading. But we just wanted to clarify that that's not necessarily something that we can speak to just because it's not an area of expertise, but in terms of the behavioral aspect of reduction of anxiety and using art as a strategy for that, with introducing artistic play and letting students engage with medium, is one way to do that piece.
That's great. Carrie, did you want to, I know you have some information that you're going to share because we're coming to a close soon, but also obviously if you wanted to respond as well to that question.
I think Amanda did a great job answering that question. And I was just looking at things I had printed out to have around me while you guys were talking. And I know I've been sharing a lot of kind of general philosophical things. So I thought maybe as we wrap up, I would just share some practical tips that I often share with educators who are new to working with students with disabilities. And these are not necessarily things that are specific to one disability or another. In fact, these are things I think are helpful when working with all students, but they are just some little practical things that may be helpful to you all. So I thought maybe I'll end with those. So one is trying to respond to body language and facial expressions. So sometimes we're so caught on what people are saying or how people communicate verbally, but you can find a lot, or you can even have a dialogue with someone by asking a question and then seeing, do they smile, do they not, you know, thumbs up, thumbs down, you know, and really paying attention and reading someone's facial expression. I see that you're smiling, so you must, so I think you do like this work. Would you want, remember, and Amanda and I talked about this before, that participants who have difficulty articulating, students who have difficulty articulating verbally, their comprehension almost always have already understood you. So just because someone can't articulate their comprehension easily to you, that doesn't mean that they haven't understood you. And this is a big misconception people have about students who are nonverbal or less verbal, that they don't understand. So there is often a difference between the level of articulation and the level of comprehension, and you should be mindful of that. Be ready to switch always to yes or no or either or questions. So think in your planning, the line of questioning you're going to use, how could you switch that to yes or no or either or? Create that environment that's filled with a sense of positive emotion and fun. Give one-on-one attention with eye contact. So some people say, oh, well, this makes some students uncomfortable. Some students not. I'm not talking about, you know, this. I'm just saying, really give people your the gift of your full attention and really listening to them. Give fidgety kids a safe art supply to hold. So like Amanda was talking about, you know, something that you can just play with, a pipe cleaner, you know, a piece of Model Magic clay, a piece of paper that they can crumple. That can be a way for kids who have a hard time being still to focus. Use a variety of supplies. I have, you know, when you give students unexpected supplies, something they're not used to using, that can really change a lot. Really affirm with sincerity and specificity. So instead of just saying, oh, great, that's great, you know, really be sincere and specific in the way that you respond to and praise students. Think about opportunities for social connection, both with you and with other students. I always say, have fun and think about high quality projects. And if it's not a project you yourself would want to do, it's probably not a good enough or interesting enough project. Thinking about mutual respect, and that a lot of kids with disabilities are not often getting respect from the grown-ups around them. So really thinking about that. Slowing down, which you can tell is hard for me. Letting kids know what to expect. relate to their special areas of interest. Find out what they're really interested in outside of school and relate your art projects to that. Be literal in your speech and demonstrate what you mean. So look at the painting. Do one thing at a time. Break things down into steps rather than giving all of the instructions at once. Be patient. It may take a student with a disability longer time to respond, and this can be really hard for us. It's uncomfortable to sit in silence, so give someone more time to respond. And don't assume the stereotype of the disability. This is the last thing I'll leave you with. So if you play to the stereotype of a disability, you're just going to keep disabling kids by limiting them. So create opportunities for students to, safely venture outside of their comfort zone and use art to explore and imagine and connect and create. And on Friday, we're going to be launching a new series of interviews with individuals with disabilities on MoMA.org. We'll drop the link now to the page where they will be, and I think you'll also get them in an email. So I would encourage you just to watch those and think about the way you interact and think about disability. And I'd love to see what you create in your classes in the next year.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you so much, Amanda. This has been so great to hear all these amazing resources. I know a lot of people have been saying in the chat, they're quickly trying to jot everything down. You are going to get the list of resources and the link to the session so you can watch it again. Again, Carrie's going to be dropping in a link that when the videos are ready in the coming days, those videos will be posted there. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us. It was all very exciting. Your questions were extremely thoughtful. You are going to receive a short survey after this to help us inform future office hours sessions and future course offerings. So in the meantime, we hope that you will keep the conversation going, that you'll keep sharing in the discussion forums, because we'd love to hear you. And thank you to all of our guests for being here today. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.